Okay, about to squat 275. I'm here for a spot. Got Christian rap music to fire us up. You got it. You got this. Oh, God. On you. One more. On you. Yeah. So that was pretty incredible. And even though he got the 275 pounds all by himself, I'm there for a spot, especially at the very end. Sometimes even the strongest of people need a spot. And what's true in weightlifting, it's true in life. There are people that you know who are carrying a very heavy burden. It might be something at work, it could be a health crisis or a relationship, and even the strongest of us at times can use a spot from a friend. And I was thinking about that when I read Titus this week. Today we're in Titus chapter 1, because we had the great apostle Paul, who wrote 13 letters in the New Testament, and most of them he wrote to churches. If you think about it, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st Thessalonians, 2nd Thessalonians, all written to large groups of people, to churches. But then we get to 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And these three books in a row were not written to a big audience. They were written to a person, to an individual. In other words, Paul cared so much about Titus that he wrote an entire letter to encourage someone that could easily get discouraged. In a way, he's giving Titus a spot. I'll grab my Bible and we'll highlight a few of the verses in chapter 1. Paul starts off by saying, Paul, a bondservant of God. I love that he describes himself as a servant, not as the great apostle Paul who wrote all these books who you better listen to. No, he said, I'm a servant of Christ. That's all that I am. And then he tells us the recipient of the letter in verse 4. He says, to Titus, my true son in our common faith. In other words, Titus was his spiritual child. Through Paul's influence, Titus came to know Christ. And then Paul says what he says in most of his letters, grace and peace to you. What a great way to start a letter. Grace, the grace of Almighty God that gives us salvation, which then creates for us a peace in our heart that we never had before. Then in verse 5, he tells them, I want you to set in order what remains. That was a Greek word that was used to describe setting a broken bone. It was a medical term. And there were some things broken on the island of Crete. And so Paul is telling Titus in verse 5, you need to appoint elders. You need to go to all of these cities and appoint pastors across the island of Crete. Now, the next few verses talk about some of the qualifications for these elders or pastors. I won't break that down because really that's kind of for me. And I read this and it always brings me under conviction as I look at the qualifications and then look at my own life to make sure I'm living the way God intends as a pastor. And then you get to verse 10 and he starts talking about some of the challenges that Titus is facing. False teachers. We've talked about that a lot, it seems, in the last month or so. There were a lot of false teachers at the time. And verse 12 might have made you chuckle when you read it. He's describing some of these false teachers. Listen to what he said. One of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, and lazy gluttons. That's not very complimentary. Liar, evil beast, and a lazy glutton. Then Paul said in verse 13, and it's true. Well, I don't know if I should be offended by that because my grandparents came to America as immigrants from Greece, and my grandfather's name is Titus, And the Sarantakis name is very common all over Crete. My ancestors might be from Crete, so I don't appreciate being called a lazy glutton and a liar. So where did this come from? There's actually a poet named Epimenides. Epimenides was from Crete, and this is what he said of his own people. There are a few times in the Bible, like Acts chapter 17, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul quotes some pagans and some things that unbelievers had said that were very common at the time. And so Paul quotes this and uses it to describe these false teachers because all they're trying to do is get rich. Verse 11, they're doing it for the sake of gain, is what he said. I'll try to shorten things up and just tell you that Titus needed to address it. So Paul says in verse 11, silence them. In verse 13, reprove them severely. So you need to silence the evil teachers. You need to set up faithful pastors in all of the cities. And basically the entire letter, chapters 1, 2, and 3, was Paul's way of giving Titus a spot. And so before we close, let me just encourage you to think about someone in your life who could use a spot. I don't know how they're struggling or what their challenge might be, but once in a while, the burden gets heavy and we could use a spot. Paul wrote a letter. For you, maybe it's an email, a text message, or a phone call. But today, let it be a day that you spot someone who could use a hand. Hey, tomorrow, chapter 2, love you so much. You're doing great. We're going to finish the New Testament by December 31st, and you'll be so blessed that you did.